after the murders, you stated that you were hearing voices.
Yeah, I did.
When he got to the chapter that said, if your right eye offend thee, cast it from yourself, he plucked his eye out.
In both Gary Green and Andre Thomas's cases, they killed their partners and children. And so people look at this and they say, I mean, this was just jealousy.
That's the easy answer. Our jails and prisons are the largest mental asylums we have in our country, especially on death row.
Do you believe that he had severe mental illness?
I believe he had mental illness. I don't believe he had severe mental illness to warrant sparing his life.
Why should people with severe mental illness not be eligible for the death penalty?
They don't know what's happening to them.
I think that man is schizophrenic as hell, but at the same time, he murdered kids.
Mental illness does not excuse you from your actions.
Did anyone ever explain to you what schizophrenia was, what bipolar was, what psychosis was?
No.
We're in Livingston, Texas, heading to the state's death row to interview a man named Gary Green, who has a long history of mental illness and who is scheduled to be executed in 2 weeks. Texas regularly executes these inmates, including people who have documented severe mental illness. So we're headed into death row. It's these two buildings right here. It's an incredibly secure environment. I mean, you can see all of the barbed wire here. You can see the watchtowers. I asked if I could do a stand-up just a few feet to my right on the grass, and the media representative here said I could be shot on the spot.
How you doing?
Hi, Gary.
You all right?
Yes, how are you doing?
Due to the circumstances, I'm all right.
Gary Green stabbed his wife nearly 24 times and drowned his stepdaughter, Jasmine Montgomery.
On September 21st, 2009, Gary brutally stabbed his wife, Levita Armstead, to death and drowned her 6-year-old daughter, Jasmine. He tried to kill Levita's 2 young sons, but they survived.
I know you have a long history with mental illness. What are your first memories of feeling symptoms of that?
It was early childhood. My biological father, he was very physical and verbal abusive to me, my mother, and on my mother's side. Her family has a long history of mental illness, documented and undocumented. A lot of them been in mental state hospitals, medicated. Their creation of madness and mental illnesses combined with mine, and it's just a cocktail of chaos.
Your brother said that you had untreated mental illness from the time you were very little. What were you experiencing? What was going on in your mind?
Bipolarism, schizophrenia, hallucinations.
Did anyone ever explain to you, what schizophrenia was, what bipolar was, what psychosis was?
No.
Did anyone ever say, let's get you help, let's figure this out?
No. Growing up as a child in the 70s, it was taboo in a black community for your child or people in your family to have mental illness. I had no outlet, no one to talk to, because those type of things was not to be spoken. So that's why it's always been a never-ending cycle, even to this day. People afraid to be treated because the stigma. Many times I tried to address those type of things with my mother, and she didn't want people to, quote unquote, to perceive her as having a child with special needs and the stigma that's placed upon that. So does that make her a bad mother? No. People does it all the time because It's a societal thing.
When you and Levita got married, were you experiencing those severe mental illness symptoms?
Yes, I was dealing with the trauma's always been there because I never been medicated, never had any therapy, never been through any type of treatment. And she used to always tell me all the time that I was bipolar and I was schizophrenic. She was diagnosing me, and it used to always make me mad because I used to tell her, why would you say things like that? That's
Levita
harmful.
would say that to you?
Yes. But all along, it's not she was saying it out of malice. She was saying that just out of concern and her own observation.
She wanted to get you help.
Right.
At Levita's urging, Gary agreed to go to a psychiatric hospital where doctors diagnosed him with major depressive disorder with psychotic features. They prescribed medication typically used to treat schizophrenia. After 4 days, Gary was able to leave voluntarily.
I couldn't find out we were getting divorced, and I knew nothing about it. We've been married less than 90 days, and you want divorced? I felt betrayed. And then I got these voices telling me, hey man, you can't do me like that. My plan was to kill all of us. Take everybody. Yeah, so we can build in the afterlife, we all could have been a happy family.
After the murders, you went to the police department, you turned yourself in, you met with the detective, and the detective stated that you were hearing voices when you committed those murders.
Yeah, I did. All that's true. The things that I'm saying, I'm not saying nothing to justify my actions. It's like constantly reliving a bad movie that every time you get to the gruesome parts and the bad parts, it always put on pause, and then it hit rewind and start the scene, every frame over and over and over. Then it plays to that part, and it goes back, and it just keep going on and on and on. This is my whole life here.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to you, Gary.
I thank you, and I appreciate it.
Okay.
Have a good day.
You too.
All right.
Of the roughly 2,400 people on death row in America, at least 1,000 have mental illness, though experts say it's underreported.
Thank you, gentlemen. The case is submitted. We'll hear arguments next in for it against Wainwright.
In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled that the, quote, insane cannot be legally executed. So to make their case, legal teams like Gary Green's often bring in experts to testify on mitigating evidence or information about the defendant's history that can sway a jury away from the most severe punishment, death. In Gary Green's case, his mental illness was introduced in court, but it wasn't persuasive enough for the members of the jury to spare his life. They couldn't see past the brutality of his crime. Is this a scan that you would ever use in your testimony, for instance?
It is, in that, this might be somebody who is suffering from a mental illness. And while scans don't diagnose mental illness, we do see common patterns in certain illnesses. And so we can piece it together like a puzzle. We see the same types of symptoms in different settings, in different testing, and that helps us make our diagnosis.
Dr. Sean Nagarkar is a board-certified psychiatrist who has evaluated hundreds of death row inmates for severe mental illness, including Gary Green. I sat down with Gary Green and we talked for an hour, and he was articulate and he told me his story. And I think some people may watch that and say, he doesn't seem sick.
This is the nature of mental illness. Nobody has 100% bad days and nobody has 100% good days. We all have our ups and downs. And this is an example of somebody who can be articulate and intelligent and thoughtful and still have a major mental illness, because it's all about, how do the symptoms present on that particular day, in that moment, with the other factors and triggers together, and that person can be very different.
What is schizoaffective disorder?
Well, schizoaffective disorder is really a melding of two diagnoses, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And so when somebody has schizophrenia, they have hallucinations, they suffer from delusions, their thoughts may be disorganized, and their behaviors may be disorganized. And then if you add on top of that the bipolar, mood swings, so people can be high, they can be depressed. When you combine those two together, that's schizoaffective disorder.
And what did you learn from Gary? I mean, what were those sort of symptoms, or what did he explain to you that helped you to make that diagnosis?
Well, a lot of it was about paranoia, that he wasn't sure who to trust, that he thought people were, his children were turning against him, his family was being turned against him, and that he became convinced that that was really going on.
Of course, there are plenty of people with schizoaffective disorder who don't commit violent crimes. How do you sort of explain that from your expert point of view?
It's somewhat perfect storm the way things happen sometimes. You're right. Most folks with mental illness are not out there committing crimes. But when you throw on illegal drugs, alcohol, stress, then they take actions which they think are justified or self-defense or they had no recourse. But when they're not psychotic, they would never have done that.
You know, in Gary Green's case, there's a lot of tragedy and there's a lot of death. You know, his victims, the stepsons he tried to kill and have traumatized. What went wrong?
I think it's an indictment of our mental health system, of not being able to get care to the people who need it. So it becomes this cycle where the violence just continues to get perpetuated.
We're in Dallas, not too far from where Gary Green killed Levita and Jasmine. And one of the things that's just so hard about these cases is that the crimes are so horribly violent. Because he didn't just kill those two family members, he tried to kill his two stepsons.
Hey. Hey, nice to see you.
One of them, JT, has agreed to talk to us and tell us how that experience has affected his life.
I don't feel like I ever got the chance to be a kid. Like, I feel like I've always been worried about Gary getting out or, focused on how my life would have been if my mom was here or my sister was here.
What challenges have you had with mental health?
So I got diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. I've had 4 suicide attempts. And as far as like at home, I can go like 2 days without sleeping.
When you hear Gary and other people say, he had severe mental illness, he was hearing voices, what goes through your mind?
I think a lot of people on the outside always try to tell you what's going on. And I think people try to make excuses for others as well. And one thing we have to realize is that mental illness does not excuse you from your actions. Like, I have mental illness, but it's up to you to have the strength to either get help or silence those voices yourself.
Did you ever see any signs of psychosis or mental illness in Gary?
Oh, I honestly don't think there's nothing wrong with Gary. I think that in a fit of rage, he did something that, he shouldn't have done. I think he knew exactly what he was doing.
Do you know that your mom pushed him to get help before all this happened?
I don't know for sure.
I mean, by his telling, and I don't know if he's credible.
Okay.
But he said he didn't think he had anything wrong with him, and your mom said, you gotta go get checked out. They both apparently went to this hospital, and we pulled the medical records from it, and they ended up diagnosing him and holding him, and then he was able to leave. And it was shortly after that that everything happened. Does that change the way you feel at all?
A little bit. That's basically saying, hey, we know there's something wrong with you, but we're gonna go ahead and let you do whatever you want to. And that, of course, I would feel like led to the death of my mother and my sister.
In the U.S. today, 1 person out of every 20 must undergo treatment in a mental institution.
In the 1950s, politicians enacted a deinstitutionalization movement, which removed people with severe mental illness from hospitals and put them back into their community.
Electroshock therapy may be recommended for other disorders.
Because legislators believed that mental hospitals were inhumane, facilities closed down, and Texas went from having 190 beds per 100,000 residents in 1955 to fewer than 8 today. Incarceration rates for these individuals went up.
We're talking about millions of people suffering with severe mental illness. Once we couldn't put them in hospitals anymore or have beds for them anymore, where are they going to go? Our jails and prisons are the largest mental asylums we have in our country, especially on death row.
Needing help from his wheelchair, heavily guarded and in handcuffs, Andre Thomas went from patient to prisoner this afternoon.
Andre Thomas is known as one of the most severely mentally ill death row inmates in America.
Andre Thomas is on death row for the 2004 murder of his ex-wife, their 4-year-old son, and her 13-month-old daughter.
In the middle of a psychotic episode, Andre broke into his estranged wife Laura Bourne's apartment early in the morning and stabbed her and her 2 children to death.
According to court records, Thomas believed Andre Jr. was the Antichrist and the 13-month-old a related evil spirit.
Following God's orders, he said, he cut out the children's hearts, believing that would free them from demons. He was sentenced to death in 2005. Bobby Peterson Kate was assigned as a defense lawyer behind the lead attorney.
Right before his arraignment, he was reading the Bible. He was fixated on it. And when he got to the chapter that said, if your right eye offend thee, cast it from yourself, that's what he did, literally. He plucked his eye out.
Since the incident in 2004, Thomas has taken out both of his eyes, eating one of them.
And after that, they determined he might not be competent, so let's send him away. So they sent him away to the state hospital. They treated him with massive amounts of drugs, got him competent, and brought him back for trial.
So wait a second. The state took him out of custody, put him in a mental health facility, gave him drugs in order to make him competent to be tried in a capital case.
Yes. And let me clarify something. There is a difference between competency to stand trial and insanity. Competency means that you're mentally well enough to help your attorney with your defense. You understand the charges against you. You're able to talk, communicate, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The insanity is whether or not you knew your actions at the time of committing them were right or wrong.
Mm.
So it's 2 different standards, 2 different things.
But if you don't understand why you're being executed or what execution is, you are constitutionally protected from the death penalty.
In theory.
Before the murders, Andre knew something was wrong. He checked himself into a mental hospital, which applied for an emergency detention order. It should have kept him there for 72 hours. Instead, he walked out in less than a day.
We basically wanted to convince a jury and get them to see how sick he was. That was the goal, was for them to understand that, for lack of a better term, a normal human being does not commit these sort of atrocities, does not pluck out their own eye, and then does not sit there casually and just look at you and can't carry on a conversation.
Why do you think the jury didn't buy that he was not guilty by reason of insanity?
In talking to the jury, they didn't care about mental illness. All they cared about was making sure that someone who had so brutally murdered 3 people did not walk in sunshine again. All it took them was looking at the video and crime scene photographs for them to make that determination.
So they actually saw the victims?
Oh, yes.
So the brutality of the crime overshadowed any of those mitigating factors like severe mental illness?
Absolutely.
What was Andre doing during the trial?
He loves sugar. So we fed him Skittles, and he would eat Skittles all day long. The only time he showed any emotion, any question about what was going on, was when the judge sentenced him to death. And he wasn't reacting to that. I was standing next to him, bawling my eyes out. And he was patting me on the shoulder, telling me that it would be okay, that everything was okay, I would be okay. So he wasn't even reacting. He didn't understand what was happening. He was reacting to my emotions standing next to him.
He had no idea that he had just been sentenced to death?
None. Sorry.
What makes you emotional about recalling that moment?
Well, having someone's life in your hands and failing. very difficult. And that's what I live with.
That apartment there is the one we used to live in.
Bryant Hughes was Laura's boyfriend at the time of her death. They lived together here in this complex and shared a daughter, Leah, the 13-month-old murdered by Andre.
Do the memories of that day come back to you?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Thing that pops out to me here is remembering all the teddy bears and the stuffed animals that was laid outside the apartment.
What was Laura like?
Happy, wonderful person to be around. Full of passion, empathy. A sweetheart.
Your little girl, Leah, was only 13 months old. What do you remember about her?
She was a daddy's girl. She never wanted me to put her down. A little Andre, too. His smile could brighten the room. I loved him dearly.
Did you ever see any violent tendencies or any erratic behavior from Andre?
Never. Personally, I never even heard him raise his voice.
Did Laura ever mention to you that she was scared of him or nervous?
No.
The night before the crime, Andre went over to Laura and Bryant's apartment for a few hours to visit his son.
How did he seem that night?
Some people might call him weird or not mainstream acting or whatever, but he seemed troubled.
Can you give me an example?
Like he had something on his mind. I could tell he wanted something off his chest but didn't know how to go about it.
How has this affected your life since then?
Bad. Let's just sum it up in one word, bad.
Have you been able to find happiness?
Well, I'll laugh and smile and joke and happiness. I'll probably find happiness when I'm dead.
Andre Thomas is 40 years old and has a date to be executed this year at the same Texas death chamber as Gary Green. From a medical perspective, is there any difference really between Gary Green and Andre Thomas?
Not from a psychiatric standpoint, no. In terms of their mental illness, the diagnoses, the way it can affect somebody can be different. But I think it's just a matter of degree. It just depends on the severity of the symptoms and when they strike a person. And additionally, again, people can be outwardly psychotic. They can do things like Mr. Thomas did that's really extreme. But you can also be quiet about it and not talk to people about it because you're paranoid. And so you hold that stuff in. Don't tell people what you're experiencing.
Do you think they should be judged differently by a jury or by those considering whether they should be eligible for a death sentence?
No, I don't think so, because I know how it affects people deeply and how it disorders their mind. And that's important that the jury be able to be educated on those things because they have in their minds what they think severe mental illness is. And that can be very different from how it presents in the real world.
The main argument in the Gary Green case were the facts of the crime. They were so heinous, so much blood, so much evil in the state's mind, and then just seeing that little girl floating in the bathtub, I just think that you just can't get over that.
I too sing America. We are darker people. They send us to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But we laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow we'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody dares sit to us eat in the kitchen. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. We too are America.
It's been 13 years since Gary Green was sentenced to death. To this day, Kobe Warren, one of his defense lawyers, and Josh Healy, the prosecutor, still disagree on whether Gary's mental illness should have been considered at sentencing. What were the mitigating factors that you were focused on?
There were some mental health issues, kind of rough upbringing, poverty, not a super stable home.
Josh, do you believe that he had severe mental illness?
I believe he had mental illness. I don't believe he had severe mental illness to warrant sparing his life.
I think one of the hardest questions in this conversation is, what is that threshold? It's not like Gary showed up to court and said, like, by the way, I have mental illness. Family history, Nysano Carter, his brother, testified that he remembers his brother acting very strangely, hearing voices, hearing demons. And then you hear from the physicians, psychiatrists, who say he has schizoaffective disorder of bipolar type. He has hallucinations. He hears voices that tell him to do things. Why wasn't that enough for you?
Because during cross-examination of their doctors and during cross-examination of their witnesses, we were able to show that he had some mental illness, but it didn't rise to the level as you are describing.
The Gary Green versus the Andre Thomas, they had similar diagnoses. Do you have to pull your eyeballs out in order to not get executed?
Let me respond to you like this. If you took both their diagnoses and actions and got 100 random people and said, who's more mentally messed up?
But it's subjective. I think that's what's interesting, is all of this is subjective.
It is.
We're just hearing dramatic details about self-harm, about what people are doing, about erratic behavior, but none of it feels scientific to me.
I would say there absolutely has to be some sort of chemical imbalance to actually and literally and physically pull out your own eyeball and eat it. Mm-hmm. It is subjective, but it's more subjective for the jurors. Mm-hmm. Like they're the ones that has to make that determination. Like they can put more credence in what a particular expert says on the defense side or the state side. It's up to them. Because honestly, what it is, it's mercy. Mm. Is if someone has enough grace and mercy in their heart to say, yeah, this is awful, this is terrible, this person, he did these things, but does it warrant that he die?
With Gary Green's case, do you have any regrets?
None whatsoever.
The jury has an extraordinary amount of power when it comes to sentencing defendants to death. And the jury is a reflection of the public. More than half the country still wants capital sentences carried out. 77% of Republicans and 46% of Democrats favor the death penalty. And that's especially true in Texas, a state that's killed more than 4 times the amount of people over the last 50 years than any other state.
We're in Huntsville, Texas, at the Texas Prison Museum to meet former warden Jim Willett. He oversaw 89 executions here, and I want to talk to him about how ingrained the death penalty is in the culture.
Those 3 pistols in there are not real. They're carved out of wood and painted. And they were made by inmates, and they were going to use them to attempt an escape.
Okay.
I find that very interesting.
So what is this that we're looking at?
This is a model of the Huntsville prison. The Walls Unit is the oldest prison in Texas. It took in its first inmate in 1849, and it is where all of the executions that the state of Texas has ever done have taken place. Now, prior to that, it was up to each county. And this is the Texas electric chair, Old Sparky. It was first used in 1924 and used up through 1964, and 364 men died in that chair.
What role has the death penalty played in the state of Texas?
Just basically, it's the most severe form of punishment that's here. I think that the people of Texas have kind of had the attitude that there are certain crimes that if you commit, we're going to consider ending your life. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just also our character from the time we ever became a state. Vast majority of the people in Texas are Christians. And I think Christians typically support the death penalty.
I believe in the death penalty, and he killed them 3 people. I believe in the Texas law. It is what it is.
Brian Hughes' daughter, Brittany, was supposed to be at the apartment the morning Andre Thomas killed her little sister, but ended up staying with her mother, Jennifer, instead. They both still struggle with post-traumatic stress.
Honestly, after that day, I don't remember a lot of anything because I was so traumatized and everything at that point, especially most of my life after that, is a complete blur. And I never understood that, how somebody could go from just being so cool and treating every kid like it's basically his and just it snapped one day.
I mean, when you hear that he had severe mental illness, that he was suffering from schizoaffective disorder, I mean, what goes through your mind?
You want to know my personal opinion? I think it's bullshit, and I think that it's a case of, oh, I can't have you, won't nobody have you.
Can I tell my opinion also?
That's my personal opinion.
I suffer from mental health as well. I think that he had a lot of mental stuff going on, and he didn't know how to handle it.
So you believe that he has severe mental illness?
I do.
Do you think his mental illness should be a reason that he is not executed?
I'm mixed about it. I am. I think that made us schizophrenic as hell, but at the same time, he murdered kids, and that's not okay. I don't want no hate or anything from this, but I prefer that he would not be here anymore.
And Jennifer, when you see Andre's name in the newspaper still to this day, and
everyone's sick.
Everyone's debating what should happen with him. Should he be executed? Should he not? I mean, what's your opinion?
I don't think he was mentally ill at the time whenever he walked in, kicked in that door to that apartment and killed those 3 people. He was not mentally ill then. Tell me how that is possible. It's not. It's not. I don't care.
I'm not right in the head, and I haven't been, maybe ever since this. Maybe that's when it started. I don't know.
It did.
I have a history of cutting myself and burning myself, so when I do go to a mental hospital, it's because my family wants me to. Other than that, I don't go.
Oh my God, Brittany, I'm so sorry.
She is a cutter. She is a burner. She's done it for about 12 years now.
Do you feel that all of these symptoms, the severe mental illness that you have now, do you think it's because of what Andre did?
Yeah. I was fine. I was a cool child. I chilled. I didn't really have any worries. And then after this happened, I completely changed. Like, I'm just like stuck.
Vice Chair Rose moves that House Bill 4075 without amendment be reported favorably to the full House with recommendation that due passage be printed. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chair Frank?
Aye.
Vice Chair Rose?
Representative Tony Rose is sponsoring a bill that would allow criminal defense teams to introduce mitigating factors at the start of the trial process, instead of at the sentencing phase.
HB 727 by Rose would end the applicability of the death penalty to a capital offense committed by the person with severe mental illness.
The chair recognizes Ms. Rose to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to just tell you a little bit about why I'm so passionate about this.
What is HB 727?
House Bill 727 is a bill that exempts persons with severe mental illness from the death penalty. It just exempts them. It doesn't free them of their crime. It's a process that's done on a case-by-case basis, and it has to be done up front, which is different from when a person is sentenced to death. All of the examinations are done on the back end.
Does that land with your Republican colleagues?
No, one of them mentioned that they were pro-life of innocent life, but because a lot of people here are not here to govern, they're not afraid to just not support good policy because they want to make sure they make the right conservative marks on their scorecards.
Why is this bill so important to you?
I spent majority of my professional career in correctional mental health. I saw where patients or individuals would commit a crime and they were psychotic at the time. And then once they're treated, to just see a totally different person. The person should get life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of executing the person because of an illness that they were born with.
And when folks say, oh, it's a slippery slope, everyone's claiming that they have, severe mental illness and this is just gonna let people get off. What do you say to that?
I say to that they need to be educated on mental illness.
Are you familiar with Gary Green's case?
I am. I'm familiar with his case. I actually was employed at the Dallas County Jail at the time he committed his crime. The young lady that he murdered was my sorority sister.
Knowing somebody who was the victim of one of these brutal crimes by someone who had severe mental illness, is it hard to have that personal connection and still advocate for this bill?
Absolutely not. I see of how the lack of access to mental health services has devastated my community. I feel like these people may be dangerous, but they're just people that need to be treated the appropriate way.
What are your thoughts on a bill like HB 727?
I don't think it's a bad idea, but I think it requires major stipulations on what y'all are doing to diagnose these people. People like Gary, I would need to see some type of testing, something that for sure lets me know that this person has a mental illness that is seriously affecting them, and they're not just using, this as a crutch.
The thing that's tricky is that he had a diagnosis from a doctor that was schizoaffective disorder of bipolar type. So, this law could have exempted him.
Right.
How do you feel about that? It's really complicated.
I honestly, if it would have exempted him, it probably would have been a lot worse. Ain't no telling my mom how she was reacting when she was getting stabbed by you. Telling how my sister was reacting when you were holding her head underwater. I just don't feel like that's fair.
In theory, you're open to this idea.
Right.
But when you're the victim and you think about this person, it's like, it's harder. It's a harder question.
Once again, no matter how old we are, no matter what we're diagnosed with, I feel like we're all responsible for our actions. And unless you have some type of mental illness that makes it to where you just can't take care of yourself and you're not competent enough to, do things by yourself, I don't see any reason why you should be excused or for taking somebody's life.
It's been 19 years since Andre committed his crimes. Jennifer still thinks about the children who died and how her daughter could have been one of them.
Those poor babies. Lord, it deserves that. Nobody deserves that. That's premeditated murder. I don't care how you look at it. It's premeditated murder. You killed your estranged wife, your son that you made with your wife and her 13-month-old baby. He played God the day of March 27, 2004. He played God 3 times.
On March 7th, people gathered from around the country to protest and pray for Gary Green.
If this execution goes forth tonight, it will be Texas's 582nd.
We're in Huntsville, Texas, and Gary is scheduled to be executed in just a few hours.
As the crowd waited for word on Gary Green's execution, news broke about Andre Thomas.
Andre Thomas was just granted a stay of execution. Yeah.
In both Gary Green and Andre Thomas's cases, they've killed their partners and children. And so people look at this and they say, this was just jealousy.
That's the easy answer. But my experience is these are much more complicated than that. What may seem obvious on the outside may be far from it once you actually delve into how that person was thinking.
How anybody could think that somebody who pulled their eyeballs out and actually ate one of them is mentally sane.
A district judge delayed Andre's execution, allowing his lawyers more time to argue for his life.
Why should people with severe mental illness not be eligible for the death penalty?
They don't know what's happening to them. We're executing a body. The mind's not there.
It appears that the execution has happened and Gary Green has been legally lynched by the state of Texas.
I pray that someone will get that cross off the top of that building. God, Jesus, Buddha, whoever you pray to, it doesn't have anything to do with killing our neighbors.
What was it like for you to be there witnessing Gary's execution?
I was just kind of there like, man, this is too good for you. You know, my mom didn't get to go to sleep. I just wish it would have been more deserving of what he did.
Do you think that you'd be sitting where you are today if you had gotten help as a child?
Well, I know I wouldn't, because that was the only era in my life that set the foundation for everything that transpired in my life.
How are you doing? How are you feeling right now?
Well, a lot of mixed emotions, because that's the question I ask myself every day, and self-evaluation 24 hours a day. And nobody want to be killed. Nobody, you call it execution, but it's still a killing. And I have a problem with anybody trying to do any harm to me. I never been the type of person that justify nothing that I do or didn't do. And I had the opportunity to prepare myself on many levels. But at the end of the day, I look at the big picture, and the big picture is it's just the cycle of life.